My name's Jann Freed, and I want to welcome everyone here. You can call me Dr. Jann, and I'm interviewing Sally as part of my Leadership Legacy Summit, where I've interviewed more than 20 people, and that will be next week. We'll release those. So you need to register, and I'll have information on Facebook and LinkedIn, and so there'll be plenty of ways to find out about the summit. But I'm very grateful. I actually interviewed Sally several years ago for my leadership book. And then I invited Sally to be a guest keynote speaker when I was part of Chrysalis Foundation in Des Moines, and she was one of the first, what we call Chrysalis Conversations. So, and Sally was reminding me that when she came, I think I just am used to it, but when she came, it was a major blizzard. And so it was very eventful. So, but Sally's wonderful. So, so what I'm going to do is just give a brief introduction to Sally, and then we're going to get into questions. And once again, if you're listening, please feel free to enter your question in the chat. Sally Helgesen, cited in Forbes as the world's premier expert on women's leadership, is an internationally best-selling author, speaker, and leadership coach. She's been ranked number 6 among the world's top 30 leadership thinkers by global gurus, and chosen as the Thinkers 50, which is Marshall Goldsmith's world's top coach for women leaders. Sally is the author of several books. Her most recent book, How Women Rise, co-authored with legendary executive coach Marshall Goldsmith, examines the behaviors most likely to get in the way of successful women. It became the top seller in its field within a week of publication, and rights have been sold in 17 languages. So welcome, Sally.
Thank you, Jann. Wonderful to be here.
Before we get into this, I know I've shared this with you before, but I just think everybody needs to know this, that, you know, when I first started teaching, and I should have looked up the date, but, you know, I want to say in the 80s, your book came out of Women's Web of Inclusion. I think
the Female Advantage, Women's Ways of Leadership was probably
Female Advantage, yes. Yeah. And you were talking about the web long before the World Wide Web was created.
Exactly, that's right.
And, you know, and your metaphors about how women tend to work more horizontally, but yet we're woven together. And I've always, you know, to me, I think you were ahead of the internet. So
I love that. I'm going to take that and put it on my. Jann Freed says Sally Helgesen was ahead of the internet. That's pretty good.
I think of that, Sally, when you're talking about your web of inclusion. So, what has been the most helpful to you personally in managing through this pandemic? Because, you know, it's, of course, we're going to talk about leadership. We're going to talk about the current times, and what has been most helpful to you personally in managing this time?
Well, Marshall Goldsmith, my co-author, and I, on the day before everything shut down, we were presenting at eBay out in San Jose. And I knew trouble was on the way because I was staying at the giant San Jose Marriott. I was one of 6 people there. So it was clear that things were changing. And as we were leaving, Marshall said to me, he's always given me very good advice, and he said, use this time to build your brand, stay connected, and be real. So that's what I worked on. Build my brand. I've been on so many programs. I did Career Day in Moscow. I did Young Armenian Leadership Institute. I've done things in Korea and Ghana and all over the world virtually. Staying connected with my core colleagues, reaching out to people, and really trying to also be real, not be overly enthusiastic about, oh, I'm pivoting my work, I'm going virtual, but really thinking through, what does that look like? What will that be like for me? How can I do it well? And taking my time to just kind of really keep it real. So that's been very helpful.
I think that's great advice. And I've been kind of doing the same in terms of this leadership summit, to learn from people such as yourself as to what, you know, we should be doing and the advice we can give. So what's been most helpful to your clients, you know, as you advise them?
What has been most helpful for my clients, and it's going to sound a little bit like this, but it's a little bit different. Whenever I've done my leadership workshops for the last 10 years, I've focused on habits and behaviors that fall into 3 buckets: being intentional, being connected, and being present. So what I've done with my clients, both on virtual workshops and hands-on sessions, but also in coaching, is try to focus what they do on how are you intentional? That is, how are you intentional about your career, but also in this environment, how are you intentional about how you're using every day? How well are you staying connected, and how well are you building your connections, not just to have a lot of people you're connected with, but to really create rich webs of support, personal, strategic, tactical, professional, networks, webs of colleagues, and then being present, really showing up. And it's hard in this environment because we're doing a lot, and a lot of it's new, and a lot of it's distracting, but really focusing on trying to be present for the moment, for the task, for the challenge, for your intention, and for the person before you, whether it's an actual human person or somebody on a Zoom call.
Yeah, no, I think, and that's great advice personally and professionally. So that's wonderful. How do you think COVID-19 is going to change leadership or organizations, how people function within? I mean, you know, again, you've got you're in a place and a platform where you have a good perspective. Yeah. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, one of the biggest things I think that's going to happen is I think we are going to shift a lot of work to working from home. This is going to unfold over years. I was speaking with a client at a big energy company that's based in the South a few days ago. And she was saying that her company is very conservative, and they've always been extremely skeptical about any work from home. And as a result, they've had problems attracting women often because of this, because women often have periods when they would like the option of being able to work from home, increasingly men as well. But she said it had really gotten in their way with women. And she said the leadership has just been astonished by the productivity that has occurred in this time. So I think that, and you know, the chairman of Tata, one of the world's largest conglomerates, based in Mumbai and London, said in a Financial Times interview I read recently that he saw 70% of their workforce working from home in the decade ahead, which is extraordinary. Now, what's fascinating about this to me is that it will be the first time, think about it, since the Industrial Revolution, when work became very compartmentalized, where professional work is done on what has traditionally been, I think we can call it female turf, that is the home, the domestic setting. And I think that's going to have some big long-term effects in terms of breaking down some of the siloization of what work men do, what work women do. That's going to be, it's going to be a really, really big thing. And the second thing I think is we have seen such spectacular results from female leaders. Of the 10 countries that have had the most success in terms of dealing with the pandemic, 7 have been led by women, and that's, you know, a huge percentage given the number of countries. So I think we're going to be looking at different kinds of leadership skills going forward. We've recognized that women are good at leading in a crisis, and that has been something that there's always been skepticism of in the past.
Well, that's a perfect lead into my next question is, what do you think the outcomes for women will be? Will they be positive? Do you think they'll be challenging? Do you think it'll be a mix of both?
Well, like everything, it'll be a mix of both. And of course, it's a challenging time. I'm not trying to just put a good face on it. It's a challenging and painful time. And we know that women do a lot of the work in terms of caring for aging parents. And personally, I know 5 people whose parents have died in this pandemic. So, there are many, many impacts. And of course, we're seeing women are being more likely to lose their jobs, et cetera. So I'm not underplaying the fact that this is very, very difficult, but I do think that it shifts the leadership conversation in a very positive way in terms of women's skills, that the collaborative style that women at their best bring as leaders, the willingness to listen, the gift of empathy that many women have, the capacity for cultivating strong relationships. I think all of these characteristics are moving, and this has been true for a while, but I think the crisis will spur it even more rapidly to move them front and center. So I think there are many, many opportunities for women in this crisis.
Yeah, I think, the time has come for finally like a tipping point, like we're ready to make some change. I often think about a paper that I wrote in college, and that was the late 70s. And the title of the paper was Women's Liberation Equals Human Liberation. And, my premise was if you free women, you're freeing men.
Yes.
And I think men working from home, they can be better, more involved in caregiving, for which, so I think the time has come, that's for sure. Well, in terms of leadership characteristics or qualities overall for the crisis, the CEOs, the people you work with, what would be your advice that we just need to know right now in terms of leading this crisis? What would you emphasize?
The leaders that I've seen who are stumbling in this crisis are the leaders who don't. Because when you have your people who not necessarily right in your control, if you don't trust those people, they know it. And the situations that I've seen developing that have been problematic, I had a woman who works for provost at a major university, and she said, she's really his point person, number 2 there in that office. And she said, he doesn't understand. He'll say something like, I need this done by today, by the end of EOD. She said, he doesn't really understand that the 2 people that he needs it done by are also homeschooling their kids. And they cannot necessarily say yes to EOD. And he'll say things like, no more excuses, no more excuses. And she said, it's just not working for him. It's not working for him. He doesn't understand. He's never been in a position where he's had to flex and use other skills and balance, because he's always had, so many people around him making sure everything gets done. And she said, I'm beginning to see what a fragile leadership style that is. And that's what I'm seeing. The leaders who are struggling in this are the leaders who don't trust their people, who feel like everything has to be done in a certain way, and that if there are issues because of the sort of inconvenience of the time we're living in, that's not acceptable, and that's just an excuse. So that's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing this really calls forth leaders to be have a greater understanding of the people who work for and with them as people who have full lives and other commitments.
Definitely. Well, tell us about your latest book. I mean, what do we need to know about it? How do women rise? I mean, I know that's a very broad question, but, based on what you've learned, what advice would you give us?
Well, How Women Rise is specifically about the habits and behaviors most likely to get in the way of successful women as they seek to move to senior levels.
Okay.
And what's distinctive about these habits and behaviors is that they often have served women well earlier in their career. So they become invested in them and they feel that they're important to their success. And yet, in fact, they can undermine women as they seek to move forward. I'll give you an example. Well, two examples that are pretty obvious, but very widespread. One is the perfection trap. Research shows that organizations tend to reward and promote women based on their being precise and correct. But being precise and correct is not what companies are looking for in terms of senior leadership. They're looking for people who are visible, for people who have great connections, and for people they believe have a strategic, a big picture vision. They're not looking for precision and correctness. So many women position themselves as doing a perfect job, but then that does not serve them heading toward a leadership level. In addition to which, being a perfectionist is a very stressful place to be, both for yourself and for other people. So that's a classic example of a habit or behavior that can serve you well early and undermine you going forward. Another habit in the book that also has that sort of rhythm to it, if you will, is overvaluing expertise. Believing that being the best person at your job, doing the best job, and I hear this a lot from women, therefore qualifies you to move on to the next job. And often women will be bitterly disappointed. They'll say, oh my goodness, I can't believe they promoted that guy when my numbers were so much better, I did so much better job, et cetera, et cetera. And what they've often neglected to note is that success in an organization always comes from three things. Expertise is one, certainly, but so is visibility and so is connections. And women particularly often tend to underinvest in their own visibility, expecting others to notice what they contribute rather than having a plan for getting known for it themselves.
Interesting. It kind of reminds me of the, Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In book that, women tend to not lean in until we have all the pieces in place.
Oh, all the pieces.
Yeah.
We're perfect.
Men jump in, they just jump in, like, of course I'm qualified. And, so anyway.
It continues. I did a program at one of the biggest healthcare companies in the world, was out in the Midwest. And we were talking about that, and that overvaluing expertise will often lead women not to apply for jobs because they feel that they do not have all the skills necessary to do that job on day one, which how could they? They'd never had the job. And so we were talking, so a couple of women in the audience, we had about 300 women there. A couple of women were saying, well, so if there are 6 capabilities, how many do you think you should have in order to apply? So it's not a question you can easily answer. So I'm kind of fumbling around. Guy in the back of the room who's this executive sponsor of the whole thing, the head of the head of North American operations for this massive multi-billion-dollar company, raises his hand and says, well, let me tell you. He said, the job that led to this, he said, I really wanted it because I thought it might lead to this job. He said, and when they posted it internally, they posted 8 qualifications. I looked at it and I said, wow, I've got 3. Okay, I'm going for it. And he got the job. And the women in the room just gasped at the idea of 8 capabilities. And he said, I realized all my job was to take those 5 where I had no experience and describe why I felt I could do a good job. And he got the job. And here he is today, one of the senior executives. And sometimes that's women are looked at skeptically, but often it's that they're underinvesting in their own visibility, or they're not taking those bold steps and saying, wait a minute, I know I could do that job. On day one, probably not, but I can learn it.
Right. Well, and that probably goes along with the research on negotiations, how women tend to not negotiate as well as they should, we feel like, well, we were lucky to get the job, so why negotiate? So, well, very good. Well, once again, I want to encourage people to put your questions in the chat because I'm going to be switching gears here a little bit. But I do want to share another story that I remember about Sally, okay? And I think about this, Sally. So when you came to Des Moines and you were speaking for the Chrysalis, it was right after your book. And what was the title about women's vision?
Yes, it was the female vision, women's
Female-
real power at work.
Yes. And
Yeah.
I remember the example that you gave, and you said, women tend to see around the corners. We can kind of see, we're not so, lateral, or we can see around the corners. And one example you gave, and you said something like, we just need power in numbers. And when there are enough women in the workplace, we won't feel awkward. They won't feel, men won't feel uncomfortable. They'll get used to us,
Yeah.
And the example you used was like cell phones. And you said, right now we start every, speaking engagement or meeting with turn off your cell phones. And you said, there will come a time when that will just be second nature. We will turn off our cell phones and it will seem natural. And I'm still waiting for that moment when, it's just as natural to have as many women in the room as men. But you're very good with metaphors and stories, and I remember
and it's true, isn't it? I used to do.
I think about that.
To speak at conferences in the early 2000s, and people would have their cell phones on, and when they'd ring, they'd jump up out of the room to go answer them, and it was perfectly, nobody thought anything of it. Today, that would never happen. We develop protocols, and
Yes.
Jann, what you say reminds me of something. I've been in women's leadership for 30 years, and for years, for decades, clients, when I was going to be doing a program, would say, oh, they're going to be men there. They're going to be men. We've invited our senior man or our whatever team. I'd say, oh, great. I'd say, yeah, expect about 20%. I'd show up. There'd be 4 men and 350 women, over and over. It is changing. More and more, when I do women's leadership programs, there's a good representation of men there. And I did a program last year in Las Vegas for the construction industry, women's leadership in construction. And I showed up at my room. It's a big, huge, massive conference at my room. And it was about 70% men. So about 70% men. And you know what they said? We don't need you to tell us that we need to get better with women. We need you to tell us how to do it. So I think things are changing in that way.
Yeah. No, one story I've been telling lately is when my book came out in 2013, before it came out, one of my chapters was called Vulnerability is a Strength. And my editor said, oh, Jann, you want to reach men, and men are vulnerability. Men are, that's not going to resonate with men. So the chapter is now called Leaders Admit Mistakes Fearlessly.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is when Brene Brown came out with her book and subsequent books, now vulnerability is resonating with everybody. Yeah. And so in a sense, I felt like I was a little ahead of my time too.
That's a good thing.
But I'm not Brene Brown, and she's quite popular now. Well, let's shift gears a little bit here. And my topic these days is leadership legacy. And when I just use the word legacy, what does the word mean to you? What is the concept, the word, what comes to your mind?
Legacy to me means what lasts from your work.
Okay.
What in the contribution that you have made has resonance for generations that come after you. Mm-hmm. That's how I interpret legacy. Some of the things that we put out there in the world will have a big impact or a medium impact, but not so much going forward. When someone leaves a great legacy, it's always new, it's always refreshed. As we've gone through the protests in the last 2 weeks, where everybody seems to be closing their emails with a different quote from Martin Luther King. Yeah. And it made me think of that legacy idea. His legacy is so rich and so fruitful that it's ever renewed as circumstances change and people rediscover the value that it has for them.
Right. Well, that's wonderful. Can you share a story that comes to mind, either related to you or related to someone you know about legacy?
Well, I certainly can, and that is my great colleague, friend, and on How Women Rise co-author, Marshall Goldsmith. Marshall has, been a top-rank executive coach in the world for decades. And he went to a workshop that another colleague of ours was delivering, and it was on leaving a legacy. And part of the workshop had all the participants asking themselves the question, what do I want my legacy to be? So Marshall really began thinking of that. And, he's certainly affected a lot of people through his books and through his coaching, but he decided that what he really wanted to do in terms of a legacy was to give away all that he'd learned in his career. So he put a thing out on LinkedIn, a little video, very homemade and awkward looking, saying, hey, I'm Marshall Goldsmith, ranked world's #1 executive coach, and I want to adopt 15 people and teach them all I know. If you're interested, apply. And he had tens of thousands of applications, sorted through them, started with 15. Now it's about 300 people. And it grew from just being younger people to being colleagues that can learn from one another. And so this group, the Marshall Goldsmith 100, which, as I said, is now about 300, is the core network group for the people who are part of it. And so important. And it really just came from him thinking, what do I want my legacy to be? I want to give this away. So I need people to give it away to, and let me pull together and see who's interested. So it was a very powerful example of how someone seeking to expand what was already, pretty significant legacy, but really make it very real for a lot of people.
Sally, that's a perfect example, because I learned about that from, I think it was David Burkus.
Yeah.
And David was describing that. And so I reached out to Marshall, because I also interviewed him for my leadership book, and asked if he would participate in this summit, if I could interview him. And he said, well, he was pretty busy working on another book.
He's got another book.
I could interview him in August. And so my plan is to do a case study on Marshall for this legacy book. So I'm working on a legacy book, and do a full-blown case study on Marshall, because, it's one thing to read his books, but for him to be passing on his wisdom, in a very personal network kind of fashion, is such a great role model, and, you could imitate that for women leaders or for anything,
Yeah.
So, I just think it's such a great model that I want to write about in detail for my book. So
I think it's a great case study, Jann.
Yeah.
I really do.
Yeah, thank you. How do you think people might change or view their legacy given the pandemic? What's going on?
Well, I think that's a wonderful question. I feel strongly that the pandemic is unfolding. And one of the things I've noticed, being really connected to a lot of colleagues, is I think that it makes us nervous because it's such a change. My whole life changed. I was on the road. I was on the road 45 weeks a year. And all of a sudden, I'm off the road. I haven't gone anywhere. I'm home. And for the foreseeable year that I can see, doing my work from home. But what I've noticed about this pandemic is it seems our expectations of how it's going to unfold keep changing. So I'm very loath to say what that will be, because I believe it's changing very rapidly. That said, I do think that it is going to have a very profound effect on how we think about leadership. Those of us, especially those of us who live in the United States, we have had so much safety that we could take for granted. Unless we were very poor or vulnerable, we have tended to assume the world is a very safe place and to feel sort of entitled to the idea of it being a safe place. And that is no longer something we can necessarily assume. So we are, I believe, going forward, going to be more invested in leaders who demonstrate the idea to us that they can help keep us safe. And I think that's going to be a very big thing, and it's going to cut down, again, in this country, but this is happening in a lot of countries in the world right now, the extraordinary and toxic divisiveness that we've had, which has been extremely ideological. Well, I don't agree with you on that, so you're my enemy. That kind of stuff is fine if everything's safe and secure and prosperous. But if things aren't, then I think we can see the futility of a lot of that kind of thinking. So I think that'll take a while. I don't think that's going to be overnight. But I think one of the legacies of this time is that it will help people get more comfortable seeking for the commonalities rather than the differences in how they think.
Right. What do we have in common versus how are we different? Yeah. No, that's excellent. Excellent. I love your emphasis on safety. That's something I hadn't necessarily.
It's important. You know, Amy Edmondson, I don't know if you're familiar with her work. She's at Harvard, but she writes on psychological safety. Okay. And her books are very, very, very important about how well-run organizations are really organizations where people feel safe speaking up, making decisions, doing their jobs, and how many leaders undercut the safety of people in organizations.
Oh, that's great. I'll look that up. So that's wonderful. Well, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat.
Uh-oh.
I know we've got some very curious people listening online. So feel free to enter a question or two, but in the meantime, I always like to ask this question of my interviewees. What else should I have asked you that either people need to know or you really want to share? Because Sally, your experience, your knowledge, everything you've done, I mean, we can all benefit from hearing. So either something you want to share or something that you really think we need to know. And I do believe, I did a quick glance, but I think it's all women online, you know, not that it matters, but what do you think about that?
Well, I think that what I want to share and what I think matters is the biggest learning of my 30 years in women's leadership has been, which is the commonality women around the world have in terms of their gifts, in terms of their style, and often in terms of what holds them back. It has been particularly fascinating with this book, How Women Rise, which now is sold in 19 languages. Oh, okay. And I have done, well, now virtually, but before that, I mean, I came with this book doing tours in India, in Japan, Korea, in Malaysia, Brazil, really all over of course, in Europe, all over the world. And then virtually, really, really all over the world. And what struck me with this is how much all the women embraced all 12 of the habits and behaviors that we talk about as the ones most likely to get in women's ways. It was really funny when I was being interviewed in Japan. What I learned was that a number of the women made the observation, oh, we thought these habits and behaviors were only habits and behaviors for Japanese women. We didn't know women in the West also, you know, were perfectionists or overvalued expertise or expected others to spontaneously notice and value their contribution or tended to minimize themselves either verbally or through body language, or struggle to be concise or to not let their radar distract them. They thought these were Japanese, and I've heard this all over. So I have a great message in terms of there's so much that women all over the world in different circumstances really share in terms of their experience, in terms of what they have to bring. So I find thinking about that, recognizing that, to be a very encouraging thing. And knowing that this is not culturally bound is very positive.
Yeah, that's a very bonding. Yeah, it does weave women together. Yeah, that's great. That's wonderful.
Yeah, even when this book came out, at first I thought, oh, how is this going to land in Kuala Lumpur? The same way it lands in Chicago. It is really remarkable.
What was probably, I know you mentioned 12 habits, what was probably the biggest surprise habit, or probably the one that surprised you? Like some of those you might have been able to assume, but your research, validated. What was probably the biggest surprise habit that women across the world might share?
Well, the tendency to put your job before your career. But the other one was, and this is a difficult habit to address. Some of the habits are fairly simple to address, but one that's really difficult is rumination. And everywhere I go, I have that, as one of the habits in the book. And what I mean by rumination is going over and over and over something that you did, thinking, why did I do that? Oh, that was stupid. What was the reason? What was the trigger? What precipitated? Really analyzing it and getting into it, believing that going over and over and over it will be helpful to you and help you avoid it in the future. Whereas in fact, research demonstrates going over and over something you did like that, all it does is it helps you spiral down, it keeps you stuck, it fills you with remorse, shame, et cetera, et cetera. And research also shows that rumination is much, much, much more common among women than men. Men kind of move on from things.
They let go. They let go of it.
They let go. They move on. Like, oh, I said that. I screwed up. Okay, yeah, fine. Sorry. Whereas women are much more likely to, oh, I'm so sorry if I offended you, blah, blah, this sort of thing, and really take it to heart. And that has been surprising to me, how constant that is culturally, that tendency to rumination.
Yeah. Well, Sally, I know you've got a hard stop, so, our time is kind of coming to an end, but I did want to say that someone put in the chat, that they love the web theme that kept coming up in the discussion. And I think you should write an article, something about the web, and refer to your very early book. And then you could even weave it to your last book about these themes that continue to weave women together across the world. So, well,
it's really true. It is like, it's funny. I mean, what I was just saying about the continuity of these habits and behaviors, it is kind of like a world wide web.
Yes, and I think you should take that and run with it. Sally, let me tell you, it's a Harvard Business Review article. Okay.
That's very interesting. What essentially in the Female Advantage Women's Ways of Leadership, which was published in 1990 and was the first book that I wrote, it was the first book to focus on what women had to contribute as leaders rather than how they needed to adapt. I used the phrase, a web of inclusion, to describe the structure of the women's organizations. And then because it got picked up and became very popular, I wrote, my next book was called The Web of Inclusion, a new architecture for building great organizations, which was about, how web-like structures and an inclusive leadership model really worked. It was really interesting because that was the first time the word inclusion had been used in a business context. And of course, since inclusion has become so associated with diversity, so that
Yes.
you have diversity and inclusion, which to me makes absolute sense, because diversity is the nature of the workforce and inclusion is how we lead a diverse workforce, the only way you can. So, so it is something to think about. And I do like, I'm fascinated by when you said that I anticipated the internet, that which really isn't true. I mean, there was the DARPANet and the early internet before this.
But I think you should own this web.
Okay.
You know, this, you know, because again, you've got it, you know, you've got a book with that. I really think you should continue to think of the work that you've done as a web, and even the last one with all the themes across the world.
Yes.
And it's a different way of looking at a World Wide Web. Sally, I love it. Well, I want to ask one last question, because I'm thrilled that somebody put it in the chat. How do you think women are women uniquely positioned to be allies for other underrepresented groups? You know, how can women help other, you know, underrepresented groups?
Yes, and definitely, I believe that women are well positioned to be allies of underrepresented groups, and that it is in everybody's interest for that to happen. And part of the reason, you know, what we look at these habits and behaviors, people say, well, why do women exhibit these? Is it, you know, nature? Is it nurture? Who knows? The fact is that women, like other people in underrepresented groups, often have different experiences. They have their expertise questioned in ways that make no sense. They see themselves in situations where mainstream leaders may not necessarily feel comfortable with them. And then they feel, you know, is it my job to put you at ease? Or, you know, or not. And if I don't, then am I going to suffer the consequences? So we're often in situations where we're sort of being expected to proactively manage other people's responses instead of just show up and do our jobs. And that is characteristic of women, but it's also characteristic of anybody in an underrepresented group. And what I've seen is the organizations that tend to have the most effective women's leadership programs tend to be the organizations that also have very robust other kinds of, as they call them these days, employee resource groups. Those are networks of people, and, you know, it can be African American, it can be Latino, it can be all different kinds of groups, but have very robust ones, but where they're really in alliance with one another instead of, you know, and trying to discover what is similar in their experience and what is similar in helping them succeed as leaders, rather than just looking at the differences.
Yeah, no,
which exist and are there. And that's not to undermine them, but that's helpful. But what's really helpful is look at, okay, how can we build on our common strengths to address what has prevented us from reaching our full potential and leading safe, secure, and happy lives.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. I could talk to you forever, because I taught a diversity course in college. And one of the points that I used to like to make is underrepresented, it's dependent on the context. So if you're talking about nursing, then males are underrepresented, and they often face the same kinds of issues. So, well, Sally, I could talk forever, okay, with you. That's great. And I always say that my purpose is to help people make the rest of life the best of life. And so may the rest be the best for you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really thriving in this period.
Yeah. And that's wonderful. And it's obvious. And I'm honored that you could make some time for me. So, and my participant. So thank you very much, Sally.
Thank you, Jann. Thank you. Look forward to this.
All right. And thank you for participating. If you were online, I really appreciate it, and look forward, watch for more information about my summit. Bye-bye.